Our next presenter is Dr. Keith Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman is the author of The Prevention of Sexual Violence, a practitioner source book, which addresses the integration of offender, victim, survivor, and prevention research to promote community safety. He is a licensed clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon. He is also a member of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, National Coalition to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation. Dr. Kaufman has chaired state prevention committees in Ohio and Oregon and co-chaired the committee that created Oregon's first statewide sexual violence prevention plan. In addition, he has served on the board of the National Alliance of Sexual Assault Coalitions and is a past president of the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. Dr. Kaufman has authored 2 books, a variety of book chapters, and a number of research articles addressing sexual violence and sexual violence prevention. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kaufman.
Good morning. I'm really excited to be here. I appreciate being invited. And it kind of takes me back a ways. And I guess before I start, let me remember to tell you that I'm going to leave a copy of my handout. So for those of you who are taking copious notes, hopefully sometime in the near future on the website, you'll be able to access the talk in its complete form. But I was going to say, this being here in Atlanta to talk about this topic really takes me back. When I look out, I see a number of colleagues that in, I believe it was 2006, were sitting in a room not too much different than this one, having discussions about just these issues. And I've been thinking about this for quite some time. And as a matter of fact, I probably have spent the last 20 years doing consultation to organizations, including youth serving organizations in terms of evaluation and program development. So I want to ask you to bear with me as I climb out on a limb. As an outsider from youth serving organizations, I want to make some observations, but I want to invite you later on today to feel free to correct me, feel free to tell me what resonated for you, and feel free to help me adjust things that are missing. Einstein said that intellectuals solve problems and geniuses prevent them. I think that there are many days, though, that myself and probably many of you think that there ought to be a corollary to that, which is you need to be a genius to do prevention. I have to say that there's amazing complexity when you start to think about prevention, especially with regard to youth-serving organizations. And that's actually where I want to start today. First thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about some observations about just the complexities of getting together as a group, as representatives of a variety of different youth-serving organizations. I want to try to acknowledge some of that complexity, and also hopefully there'll be a spark to get you thinking about similarities, differences, things that we can use to foster ongoing conversations after this meeting. I'd also like to be presumptuous enough to try to give you my list of what I think would be ideal characteristics for prevention for youth-serving organizations. I have to say that I've been working with Boys and Girls Clubs for about 1.5 years now, and I have a wonderful consultant in Les Nichols who I keep checking things out with. So I want to say that if it's right, thank Les, and if there's a problem, come see me, okay? So the other things I'd like to do with my time today is I'd like to introduce you to the situational prevention approach and the situational prevention model. I think it's a model that has a lot of promise, and I want to tell you about a wonderful collaboration that I have going with Boys and Girls Clubs of America that's funded by the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape that I think speaks to some of the issues that we're all here for. So let me start by talking about prevention challenges and what some of my observations are around those. When I started thinking about the complexity, a whole host of things came to mind. I started thinking about different organizations that I know about, and part of what struck me is there were lots of things that made it complex to think about prevention, to think about coming up with common prevention strategies. There were things like the organizations that have local affiliates, and some of you have many local affiliates. As I said, I'm more familiar with Boys and Girls Clubs. They have over 4,000 local affiliates. There's also issues that are reflected in diverse community settings that your organizations are set in. There are differences in your programming. There's issues about your parent organization size, also your affiliate size. That could be the size of their buildings. It could be their staff. It could also be the size of the youth that any of them serve. Many of you serve multiple age ranges. Some of you are more specific about that. Many of you use volunteers. Some use volunteers more than others. During the summer, for some of you, your programs change drastically. You offer camps. You offer different kinds of services. Your numbers may go way up. Your issues about hiring staff, about having more volunteers become much more pertinent. And all of these things are dynamic from month to month and from year to year. You get money in, you add programs. Your focus changes. You open up a new organization or affiliate in an area, and that leads to serving a new population. Complexities. Another complexity in thinking about issues of prevention is the issue of how can we think about offenders? And Dr. Finkelhor did a wonderful job of detailing this, but let me just highlight a couple things that I think are pretty significant. We really are challenged in the fact that in many ways, many of the offenders we're talking about are much more similar to us than they're different. Hard for us to think about, but true. We can't recognize offenders by looking. There's no reliable sex offender profile, and sex offending has not been associated with a particular sexual preference, age, race, religious affiliation, or economic group. I also got to thinking about factors that may make a difference. What I mean by that is there's a multitude of things that make us similar and different as youth-serving organizations, but there may be some that are more critical than others. And this is another place I had wonderful help from Les. He gave up an evening of sleep or a night of sleep to do consulting on the phone and talk me through some of these things. But if you think about it, down the left-hand side are some ideas that I had and we had about key factors that may make a big difference in terms of what risks look like. And we started thinking about issues around different levels for each of these. So, for example, if you start thinking about location, you may own a building or buildings. You may co-locate with schools, for example. Or you may, for example, be someone who offers youth sports where not only don't you have a building, but you move around. And each of these things offer different kinds of challenges in terms of risks. If you own your own building, it might be a 100-year-old building that's been added to 50 different times. And each of those additions adds a little bit of a warren or a cubbyhole, an extra hallway, a stairs that may be a risk. If you share space with a school, it may be that there are things that you see that you'd like to change to make your environment safer for the youth you serve, but one of the challenges is you don't have complete control over the environment. If you're a youth sports organization, it may be one of the most challenging types of experiences in terms of, what do they say, herding cats? When you invite your teams to an area that has no fences, that has multiple fields, that has cars coming and leaving. So it seems to me that some of these issues are critical issues. Let me give you another example. Even something as simple as programming. If you think on the one hand about programming that's much more structured or fixed, well, what that may mean is that over the course of the time that youth are with you, they're in a particular place. You know where they should be. they're supervised, and if they're somewhere else, you know they don't belong. On the other hand, if you have a program that's much less structured and offers many more opportunities for youth to engage in different things, you have the other side of the coin. And because of your commitment to a particular kind of programming, you also have to think differently about the risks. You want to support your mission by allowing youth to engage in different activities, move around your facility perhaps, but at the same time, you have different risks to worry about in terms of how to maintain safety. So this table offers another dimension of some of the complexity of thinking about how we address issues around prevention. You'll notice we also put staff on this. We put some critical issues around how one-to-one interactions are handled. If you're a mentoring program, that's the core of what you do. If you're some other programs, you have rules against that. Each of those things make a big difference in terms of the risks that you have to address and have to think about. Each of those things perhaps sort the folks who are in this audience into different groups. And if you draw the line across those, if I were able to hand out a questionnaire and have you fill out which you are in terms of which boxes for your organization, we might end up with 10 or 15 different profiles. So important to think about the complexity, important to think about what implications that has for us today and going forward. Now, I don't want in any way, shape, or form to give the impression that youth-serving organizations haven't done their due diligence, haven't really strived to make a difference in terms of youth safety. I want to talk about two ways in which it seems like youth-serving organizations have thought a great deal about that. One is proactive, and sometimes we talk about that as primary prevention types of strategies, and the other is more reactive, which might be secondary or tertiary prevention. And there's a whole host of proactive things that are done across most youth-serving organizations. Everything from the hiring practices that Dr. Finkelhor talked about and that I've overheard conversations about since I got here yesterday, to offering very specific content-based types of programs. It might be that you offer a very specific training for youth to enhance their safety, or a specific training for your staff or for your volunteers, or for youth's parents, or perhaps for all of those folks. You also create safety with policy, and you create policies that are consistent with your mission, and you create different kinds of policies around that issue of one-to-one, for example. There's also the area of what some people call prevention through environmental design. And that's if you're lucky enough to be building a new building, for example, that you may use an architect, you may use some people with some special skills to design that facility so that you maximize opportunities for supervision. One of the things they're always talking about is line of vision. If you can design it so that your staff are located most of the time where they can look around without even moving and provide supervision to a large proportion of the youth you're serving, you're obviously much better off. If you have a 100-year-old building, you might have a different challenge, right? Also, safety checklists and guides. I know that some of you already have specific checklists that help people through everything from is your vehicle safe to how do you make sure that you know who's supposed to be on the bus and who's not on the bus, who's on a field trip, and how do you do your count, how do you make sure your staff is there. There are also reactive strategies that many of you or most of you use. For some of you, you have access to a national organization when a concern comes up. So if there's something that's happened, if there's something that's the bud or beginning of a problem, you can call someone at national and get some consultation before that becomes a bigger problem. For others of you, you have local affiliates or a local structure or administration where you can get consultation. If, unfortunately, something has actually happened and been particularly problematic, many of you do root cause analysis on that issue to make sure that there's learning that goes on so that your organization is healthier next time, perhaps can make a better decision, and that you're in a better position to protect the youth. Included in this are also a lot of forms, a lot of procedures, a lot of guidelines that help us through when we have difficult kinds of situations. So one of the things, that just looking across what we've just talked about, just some reflections that most of these things are what I would call person-related. What I mean is that we're talking about things like hiring someone, and we're interested in who we're going to hire. Or we're talking about one-to-one interactions. It has to do with your staff member or your volunteer interacting with one of your youth. It's probably fair to say that if you're like the rest of the world, that there's probably more of what you do that's reactive than proactive. And clearly there are policies, procedures, resources, and practices that exist sometimes in abundance in your organization, and yet one of the things that I don't see as often is a comprehensive type of integration of those pieces. Keep that in mind. I'll come back to this. So here are some of my thoughts about what might be ideal. Okay? And again, think a little bit about if you were writing down a list of the things that would make for an ideal prevention approach. See which ones of these would be on your list and see what you would add. I would think it would have to be something that's comprehensive in scope. David talked a little bit about this. There's a real advantage. We can't go to our local affiliates and say, do this assessment about child sexual abuse. And then there's 4 or 5 other assessments I want you to do separately. Makes a whole lot more sense to integrate them into one combined type of assessment that might deal with prevention of inappropriate sexual behavior, that might deal with child sexual abuse prevention, that might have to do with physical safety, that might have to do with health concerns, and so forth. It's also important that whatever we come up with as a prevention approach, it's important that it's sensitive to our logistical needs. So what would be ideal is if you could have a prevention approach that paid you for doing it, right? That's a test. Anyone smiling? Okay. But, you know, maybe we're not so far away from that. Hold on to that thought. It needs to be straightforward. It needs to be easy to complete. It also needs to be something that you can get help for. You can't saddle the director of one of your units or one of your affiliates with doing something because they're the only one with the skills to do something. It has to be something that they can get help with. It also has to be adaptable. It has to be something that you can use with different program structures, with different missions, different goals, and different practices so that it can be useful to a lot of different youth-serving organizations. Hopefully, it's also something that you can tailor. You want to be able to tailor it to your clientele, and we know that your clientele may be diverse. If you're in 50 different states, and if in each state you have multiple locations, chances are you're serving a vast and broad array of different type of youth. Hopefully it's something that would also fit for particular and different kinds of physical structures. In my example before, those you own, those you share with others. And also, hopefully it taps what is most germane to the people, to the youth we're serving, their families, and the folks in your affiliates, which is some of the culture of that particular facility and the families that use that. On my wish list would be that it was bottom up, that it was a grassroots-based program rather than top down. And part of the reason is I would want as much input as possible. I would also want as much buy-in as possible. I've had many conversations about how difficult it is to chase after parents to be included in things, or sometimes to get youth. It would be nice for them to know that this was a program that was designed for them and that we want their inclusion. Also, hopefully, it would address the dynamic nature of these organizations over time so we could repeat it on a regular basis. And when we repeated it, let's say in 6 months or a year, we'd be looking for 2 things. We'd be looking for the things that we think we fixed. We'd want feedback to see that those things are fixed. And the second thing is we'd want to know, are there other risk factors in the environment that maybe have happened as a result of changes in our programming, who we're serving, our facilities and such. I also think that on this wish list, and this is going to be a long one, right? On this wish list, I'd like a mechanism that would identify and address risks. We know from a lot of other types of problems, we know from our colleagues at the CDC that it's a real advantage to use an approach that identifies risks, intervenes with the risks, and also hopefully promotes protective factors so that we keep people safer in the long run. I'd also argue that it would be better if it was a process rather than content-based. What I mean by that distinction is content-based is something like we do where it's written for a particular population, it has a bunch of steps, it trains and it offers some skills, some knowledge, and those things. A process-based thing is much more flexible in terms of tailoring itself to a particular setting, organization, mission, and such. So it's silly for me to even talk about this, but I couldn't help myself. Why do we need to enhance prevention with youth-serving organizations? So bear with me. Well, first off, if you look at the numbers of youth who are involved in youth-serving organizations, they're staggering. I mean, it's probably most, if not all, of our population. Every day, more than 57 million youth go off to school. Estimates suggest that more than 41 million youth are involved in youth sports. And some of our colleagues around the room, Boys and Girls Club, report about 4.9 million youth, and Scouts, I believe it's around 2.8 million. The other thing we know is offenders are attracted to places where there are large groups of youth, especially if they have the perception that there are chinks in the armor. If they have the perception that this is an easy place for them to find a child or a teenager, then they're going to be more attracted. And sadly, as we all know, despite everything we do, all you have to do is open up the newspaper, and there are still reports of abuse in youth-serving organizations. So where does this get us? Well, about 4 or 5 years ago, it got me to the point of thinking about the fact that we really needed some sort of systematic framework that linked tailored prevention efforts with specific risks identified in an organization or an institutional setting, and something that led us then to some solutions. And one of the things that I found that I think may have some promise, and again, this is one model, this is one approach, there's probably a lot of others out there, is something called the situational prevention model. I want to spend a little bit of time telling you about this model and where it came from and where the support for it is, so you can have some sense of kind of the foundation. There's 3 particular theories or approaches that support the situational prevention approach. One is called rational choice theory, one is called routine activity theory, and the third is called defensible space theory. These are 3 theories that have been around for quite some time. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Rational choice theory first. The assumptions here are that offenders are active decision makers, that they intend to obtain a benefit, whether that's power, sexual gratification, money, depending on what the crime is, and that they seek to avoid consequences. Pretty simple and straightforward. It also suggests that offenders are always engaging in a cost-benefit analysis in their head. They're always thinking about what are the potential gains, what are the risks. We know that their choices are constrained by the information they have, their perceptions, their skills, the time they have to make a decision. We also know that over time, if they're not caught, they probably get better about making this cost-benefit analysis. And over time, they also make a decision about how much they're willing to risk, how much risk they're willing to tolerate for a certain amount of gain. This theory is very much based in looking at the environment, so more pertinent to us. You know, we're talking about places that might be an isolated location or a location inside one of our youth-serving organizations that doesn't have the same kind of traffic. They're also very interested in situational factors. And when I say situational factors, it's when they're in a particular situation, what are the things that either increase the likelihood that they're going to act out or the things that are going to deter them. One example might be a parent being in the neighborhood or the area, or one of your staff or a volunteer. As you can see, this is a theory that's been applied in criminology across a whole host of other types of criminal behavior, including some studies that have applied it to child sexual abuse and serial sex offenders. Second foundation for this approach is called routine activity theory. And this is one of the core environmental criminology theories. Its focus is on crime characteristics and the environment in which crime occurs. It downplays offender characteristics. It's less oriented towards the offender as an individual. The assumptions that this theory makes is that three things have to happen for a crime to occur. One is that there has to be a suitable victim that's available. Second, there has to be some lack of supervision or guardianship. And third, there has to be the presence of a motivated offender. And again, this is a theory that's been around for a while, and it's a theory that has found positive application and some success with a variety of different types of crime, again, including sexual aggression on college campuses, among other things. The third foundation for this approach is defensible space theory. And defensible space theory suggests that there are actually things, there are elements in our environment that either increase the likelihood or decrease the likelihood that a crime can occur. It's very much based on architecture and on city planning. And it's really rooted in the idea that there are certain physical arrangements and certain designs for spaces that, again, either increase vulnerability or reduce vulnerability. Three particular characteristics or key pieces of this. One is the extent to which a sense of territoriality is created. And that territoriality can be created either in a direct physical means, the idea of having a door that locks, or it can be symbolic. It can be putting up signs. It can be putting up lights in some ways. Also, natural surveillance is a key part of this. So if we were talking about housing, it's not coincidental that housing developments have houses that face each other. The idea is to try to get people looking out their window at their neighbors' houses, walking in and out the doors in a way that people keep an eye on each other's property. The third element is the element about image. What's the perception about physical space? Is the perception about a particular house or location that it's neglected or abandoned? Or is it that it's well kept, somebody's paying attention to it? Three primary and key assumptions. One of the things we find with defensible space theory is it's been around for 40 plus years. It's been used as the basis for creating safer housing in neighborhoods, and that it's been linked to reductions in crime. So back to situational crime prevention. Situational crime prevention draws from these three different theories as a basis. It focuses pretty simply on opportunities for crime to occur. It's very focused on risks, and it's a probability-based theory, and the question is how many risks are in this environment, and to what extent do they increase the probability of something bad happening, and how do we reduce that? So it focuses on environment, on settings, and the purpose is to prevent the occurrence of crime. Again, it's a theory that perhaps is best in concert with other types of theories and interventions that maybe focus more on individual characteristics, because that's not the strong suit of this. Situational crime prevention de-emphasizes especially the characteristics of the offender, their motivation, issues around punishment and motivation, and detection, I should say. So let me just tell you real quickly how I got involved in this. 2005, 2006, get an email from Australia. Seems pretty exotic, right? It was a criminologist who was looking to import situational prevention into the area of prevention of sexual violence because it hadn't been done before. And it was a question about whether or not I'd be interested in trying to take the theory and apply it to the prevention of child sexual abuse. The book was going to have all chapters that were related to prevention of different forms of sexual violence. And I was fortunate enough to get an invitation to write about importing this to fit for prevention of child sexual abuse. And I said yes, because you always say yes, because they always tell you you have 6 months, you know, and then 2 weeks before, suddenly you're in panic, right? But the chapter was one of those chapters that was a little bit challenging to write because it really was trying to fit something from another world into our world and the things that we deal with. It was also one of those chapters that I was sure that maybe my mom would read, and that would be about it. But interestingly enough, about 4 or 5 months later, I got a call from somebody who was affiliated with a major children's hospital that had just discovered that two of their employees had offended and had been offending against youth for a long time. And that turned out to be one of 2 opportunities I had to apply this to a hospital setting. It also led to me writing a chapter in the book that Mike mentioned earlier, and also a chapter for a book in the UK. And it led me to my wonderful collaboration with Boys and Girls Clubs of America that I'm going to tell you about in just a little bit. So that's kind of how situational prevention came into our world and how I got involved in the process. So this was about 2006, 2007. So let me try to give you a little bit more detail about what situational prevention is like. Let me also give you a little bit more information about this project that I'm working on with Boys and Girls Club. Before doing that, let me say that situational prevention, or the situational prevention approach as we've conceptualized it, it's process-based, and the focus and the core of it is identifying risks and coming up with solutions for risks. The solutions tend to include either what we would consider prevention or risk reduction when we can't do prevention. Again, it complements other types of content-based types of prevention strategies. And I have to say to you that the list of ideal things for my youth-serving prevention was part of what I used in writing the chapter, and part of what I've been thinking about, and part of what went into what we're doing with Boys and Girls Club. So I hope you'll find that for many of those ideal things, that there's at least something of traction for this approach to meet many of, if not all of, those ideal types of characteristics. I'll let you be the judge. Again, we were very fortunate that we got funding from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape to do a 2-year pilot study. It's been a great collaboration from my side and hopefully from Boys and Girls Clubs of America. They've been very generous and very helpful. The goal in the first year of this project was to develop a prevention self-assessment process that could be used with the 4,000 plus Boys and Girls Clubs as a self-assessment. In other words, what we were trying to work towards and what we've been working towards is being able to put something on the website that a club with no resources could download and successfully use on their own without having to pay for consultation, without having to get guidance. Hopefully there would be some support and guidance, but our goal was to make it as sustainable and as easy to use and as clear to use as possible. In the first year, the process that we used was we took what I had used in those children's hospitals, what I had used and written about and talked to some other people about, and we went to 3 different cities, to 7 different Boys and Girls Clubs. We worked with 3 inner-city Philadelphia clubs, 3 inner-city Pittsburgh clubs, and a club in Portland, and we actually worked through the 6-step process that I'm going to tell you about with them. And I have to say it's very humbling, because the whole purpose of us being there was for them to tell us what didn't make sense, what was wrong with our approach, how it could be better, how to tailor the language, and how to make it fit the Boys and Girls Club culture in a way that at some point in the future we could hand it off to somebody. The products we expected, the key product was an implementation manual, and I'm pleased to say that we have an implementation manual now. We're just integrating some feedback that we got from some outside folks and also from some of the folks in the clubs who had actually been through the process last year. I'll come back to the Boys and Girls Club project in a minute, but let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Let me tell you a little bit about what this 6-step process is. Let me see if I can build on a little bit of richness of how we've been able to do this with clubs and what we've come to as a model that fits for Boys and Girls Clubs. May not be something that fits for all other kinds of youth-serving organizations because we specifically worked to tailor it to Boys and Girls Club. So the first step in this 6-step process is to brainstorm risks to create a preliminary model of what are the risks that exist in the environment. And what we typically do, again, we're trying to make this simple, low cost, low demand. So what we found we could do is we could have 1 2-hour meeting with a group that we called a work group that involved some Boys and Girls Club administrators, perhaps a director of a particular club, a representative staff member or two, a volunteer person, and some board members, and there was also the ability, if they wanted, to add a key informant. So 1 2-hour meeting to get the ball rolling with brainstorming. We did a separate, about an hour to hour and 15-minute meeting with a group of parents who were willing to volunteer. The pizza helped a little bit. And then a separate 1-hour meeting with youth from the club. And part of the reason for including the parents and the youth is we really wanted it to be grassroots. We really wanted to also make sure that we weren't missing risks that existed in the environment. And lo and behold, there were some really interesting things that both the youth and the parents suggested as things that needed to be addressed. We kept the youth and the parents separate from the work group because we didn't want to scare them. We all know that every environment has risk. It's risky to walk out the door and cross the street, but we wanted to make sure we didn't do something, we didn't accidentally do harm. We didn't convince parents that there must be something bad going on because you're asking me for my input. So that was the one place that we got input from parents and from youth. Let me show you what we came up with areas to brainstorm around. Now, the white area that you see up there, we conceptualized as the things that the club had the most control over. And around that was their community environment, and the things that fell into that area were things that they might be able to influence, but they didn't have quite as much control over. So we brainstormed around what we called characteristics of at-risk youth. And the conversation we often had with staff was, as an example, that child who walks in the door and immediately climbs up on an adult's lap. So maybe a child who's needy, maybe a child who has a developmental delay. We're also interested in characteristics of the families that go with those children. So it might be a family that has an alcohol or a drug problem, or it might be a family with a wonderful parent who's a single parent and has to work 2 jobs and as a result doesn't have the ability to provide the supervision that you would hope. We also asked them to brainstorm around high-risk locations inside the club, around the club grounds on the outside, and we asked them to also think about any place that they take the youth on a field trip and consider that part of their own. We added this area called facilitators, and facilitators aren't necessarily a risk in and of themselves, but they're something that tend to lead to a bloom of risks. Let me give you an example. On a wonderful June day when the sun's out and it's warm, 2 or 3 staff members get together and they say, hey, let's call in sick tomorrow and let's go to the beach or the lake, right? Seems like a great idea, except at work, suddenly there's this mismatch in terms of the ratio that you would expect in terms of staff and youth. There are some other things that end up in that category sometimes that are counterintuitive. Sometimes we talk about long-standing staff because we know that oftentimes they're not supervised in the same way. We know that sometimes they're not expected to follow rules. So we ask them to brainstorm about facilitators. In that idea of trying to make this broader than just the issue of prevention of child sexual abuse, we also ask them about other types of youth-based concerns, including health concerns. Could be a club that had roof leaks and they have mold in the walls. That would be an example. Accident prevention kinds of issues could be anything from a broken sidewalk to gym or play equipment that isn't quite right. And we also ask them to think about physical health concerns. Could be bullying, could be gang trouble that comes inside, could be something similar that threatens their physical safety. We also look or ask them to brainstorm around club policies. And usually that discussion is a discussion of, are there policies that are missing? Are there policies that need to be modified? Or are there great policies that never make it to either staff or to volunteers? The possibility that, for example, when you ramp up in the summer for your camps and you have 5 times as many youth and you hire people quickly, that perhaps you don't orient everyone, and then suddenly you have staff or you have volunteers who don't know what the rules are. If you move out to the community in terms of areas for brainstorming, we also ask them to think about community policies. And they bump up against these oftentimes in the summer when they're going to the swimming pool or when they're going to a park or something like that. An example might be some group being slotted into a pool where it's a general swim time. Suddenly the staff not only have to worry about the physical safety of their children, but they have to worry about the adolescents and they have to worry about the adults in the pool who are in close proximity because that's the rule. It's open swim. We also ask them to think about lifestyle and routine activities, both of the family and the staff. On the staff side, routine activities might be transporting youth in a van, which works out fine until you're left with a single child and the driver, perhaps. Or in a environment where it's dark out, it's the middle of the winter, a staff member or volunteer is driving home, and they see a child walking by themselves and they're fearful for their safety. They know there's a rule against driving them in their car, but they pick them up anyway. On the family side, routine activities might be a child who walks back and forth through a dangerous neighborhood or takes public transportation. One of the things that's come up is bus stops at night that have no lights. So we get them to think about those things. And the final area that they brainstorm about is the larger community environment. Some of the clubs that we worked with, not unlike many other inner city areas, 40% of the buildings around the club were abandoned. And that's what the children walk through. That's what the youth play in. But you know, there can be other things. It can be gang activity. It can be busy streets. Now, this is where we stop in terms of what we ask them to brainstorm, but the model also has 2 other pieces that I think are important to point to. One is some knowledge about who are the offenders in the community. How many are there? How well are they treated? How well are they supervised? What kinds of issues come up with regard to that? And the other that just affects everything everywhere is socioeconomic status. Obviously, there's a huge difference between your affiliates that are in a part of town where they're right in the midst of very well-to-do people, where they garner a lot in the way of donations, and that's a much different experience than your affiliates who are in inner city areas where they don't have 2 nickels to rub together. It affects everything they do. It affects how they address their risks and what kinds of solutions are available to them. So this is what we have them do in the first brainstorming phase. And let me just quickly give you a couple more examples of what you get. And this is totally hypothetical, but hopefully it gives you an idea. For lifestyle and routine activities, one of the things you might look at are one-to-one activities depending on what your mission is. We talked about parents who work 2 jobs. Maybe family substance abuse problems would be another example. The larger community environments, some other examples might be dark alleys. It might be places where children take shortcuts. It might be isolated streets that you know that your youth are using. For at-risk youth, it could be children that you know lack supervision. It could be teens who you know have expressed an interest in staff members or volunteers. They're attracted to them. They've approached them. For high-risk locations, it could be the kitchen area after lunch. It could be that you run a program that is for younger kids that ends at 6 o'clock. They all go home, but you stay open until 9, and all of those areas are dark and empty. Facilitators might be poor supervision. It might be areas where there's very little traffic, where things can happen. And it could also be lapses in communication. Club policies might be places where background checks don't happen for volunteers. It could be no front desk check-in for people who are parents or who appear to be parents. For community policy, some other examples might be the hedges too high in parks. It's actually come up. And you know, cities now, economically, they want to save money. What do? They let everything grow up taller. Wonderful idea unless it's around the playground equipment, and now it obscures line of sight, and you have issues. So these are some of the other things that might come up as part of this brainstorm. The second step in the process is soliciting a broader input via questionnaire. So remember, we had these small work groups. They may represent all of the folks who work there, or they may be a very small proportion of the folks who work in this particular setting. What we want to make sure we do is get input from all of the staff in the setting and from all of the volunteers. So what we do is we drop those risks into a pretty simple survey type of questionnaire where we ask folks 2 questions. We ask them, how often do you see this risk on a daily basis? And how worried or how concerned are you about this? What this does is a couple things. It also has some blanks so that if there are missing risks, the other staff and volunteers can add the risks. Also, it helps the organization prioritize the risks. Usually what we have folks do is prioritize them based on how risky they feel it is or how concerned they are, and they use the other column to kind of clarify. So now you have a list of prioritized risks. The third step is a couple of meetings of that original work group, 2 2-hour meetings. We usually find fairly sufficient. And what they do is they go through every identified risk, and they begin by asking the question of, can we prevent this? Because obviously we'd rather do that. So if, for example, there's an issue of access at a particular organization because there are 3 doors that people come through, pretty simple, we can prevent that. We lock the 2 doors that don't lead to the front desk. But there may be some instances, for example, your organization may offer evening basketball, which is a wonderful thing. It brings parents in, it brings community members in, but it's also a really big challenge. Now, you could prevent that by locking them out. Probably wouldn't work very well. It's not consistent with your mission. But what you could do is you could do risk reduction instead. You could make sure that there was 1 door they came through. You could make sure everyone signed in. You could make sure that everyone wore a name tag. So the attempt here is to take every risk, either come up with a prevention strategy or a risk reduction strategy, and then also, as part of this, answer the question of how much will this cost? Do we know where the resources will come from so it can become a realistic solution? At that point, things get turned over to the administrative people in the organization or in that particular facility, and it's up to them to look at the list of risks and solutions they have and to go ahead and to do some prioritizing based on that. And what we ask them to do is to sort into 2 piles, if you will. We ask them to sort into a pile of easy fixes and more challenging things. So the locking the doors would be in the easy pile, and the dealing with the basketball and the influx of people would be in the more challenging. And what we've tried to suggest to them is that they only think about addressing 5 things at a time, and that those 5 things are always made up of 3 easy things to fix and 2 more challenging things. So we want to put some bounds, and we want them to be successful, and we want to make sure that they have a very specific plan for addressing these. At this level, we have them fill out a 1-page implementation plan that's pretty simple and straightforward. It looks something like this. It has, they fill in what's the risk, what's the prevention or risk reduction strategy they're working on, what are the tasks or the steps that lead to achieving that prevention goal, who's responsible for each one of those steps, what are the costs associated with those steps, and is there a resource you can think of, and what's the due date for each of those steps, and the final column is, does this require some modification of your policies? The 6th step is either the easiest one or the most challenging one, depending on how you think about it. It's the idea of making a commitment to doing this once a year or once every 6 months. Again, with the hope of taking a look at which of your solutions have stuck and worked, which ones need a little bit more modification, and also what are the new risks that you need to worry about. So let me move back to the Boys and Girls Club project and tell you a little bit about what we got out of the first year. And again, this was all anecdotal. We weren't collecting data. This wasn't a research project. This was a development project. We were trying to develop a strategy. But that said, we found that these amazingly busy, under-resourced clubs were still interested and willing to engage in this process. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you that they all started out skeptical, but when they figured out this wasn't about taking something that was created somewhere else and hand it to them to try to make work, but instead was something that was only about the risks that were the ones that they identified, that they needed to solve, and that they would be the ones who would be generating solutions. They got much more interested in the process. They did generate a lot of risks, and I would think that no more than any other type of organization, but there's a lot of things going on. I will tell you that in some different organizations, people have pulled me aside and showed me their usual system for dealing with these things. It usually involves a whole bunch of Post-its, right? And some of them fall on the floor, some of them get into the pile of papers, some rise up, some fall down. And a lot of folks tell me that they worry, they go home at night worrying about what's on those Post-its. We found that folks were willing not only and able not only to come up with risks, but they came up with very creative solutions that were very doable. And we actually had instances where I flew out to Philadelphia or to Pittsburgh to do the, to work them through the risk development meeting, the brainstorming meeting. Came back 3 weeks later where we were going to generate solutions. What did I find? Lo and behold, there were a whole list of risks that were taken care of. They already fixed those. Okay? So it was a very generative process. Also, the participants reported that they liked this process. It was something that was doable, it was simple, and it was something where if they invested time in it, it was something that they felt they would have had to do anyway, because that's part of their job, is to ameliorate risks. Also, what we did was we did come up with a implementation manual, as I mentioned to you, and that brings me to the second year of the project, which, if I wasn't here, I would be starting. And we'll be starting in the next couple weeks. And the second year of the project is designed to start to collect some data about the efficacy of this approach. I mean, I'm excited about it. I can tell you they were. But what carries the day is the scientific method, having some data, having something that you can hang your hat on. So what we're doing in the second year is we've identified 16 clubs in 4 different states. What we're comparing is the SPA, or situational prevention approach, to business as usual, as well as doing some pre-post measures. we're also probably going to do a somewhat longer follow-up with them. And, you know, this is always the dilemma with prevention, right? How do you measure something that didn't happen? And how do you also know that you had something to do with the fact that it didn't happen? Well, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at satisfaction and utility. We're going to look at how many risks have been identified prior to the start of this, and then after they started it, and then I'll show you in a minute in some follow-up periods. We're going to look at how many prevention solutions and how many risk reduction solutions were generated, and then we're also going to look at which of those solutions and how many of them were actually implemented. We're also kind of interested in this idea of staff empowerment. We're having a little bit of trouble finding measurements, so we're probably going to create our own, have a draft of something. It's basically the idea of if you were to look in one of your facilities, you can probably differentiate between some staff who are always vigilant and believe that part of their job is seeing that something's going to happen and making sure that they intervene early on so it isn't something bad. And then other staff who you know, perhaps don't feel like their job is much broader than a certain list of tasks. One of the stories I tell is I was someplace where room full of kids, somebody comes in to vacuum. I'd say the room is maybe as wide as this room. They plug in the vacuum there. They start to vacuum. Within a few minutes, there's this cord that's 1.5 feet off the floor and stretched 30 feet. The kids are playing jump rope with it. Staff are stepping over it. Nobody says, why don't we move the cord over there so someone doesn't get hurt? So for me, that's the epitome of staff that aren't empowered and that don't see their role as intervening for anything in the environment that may cause a risk. And we're interested in whether or not being part of this process would lead youth or staff or volunteers to maybe change the way they think about their role and maybe become more proactive. A little bit more challenging to measure. This is a graphic example of what we're trying to do or what we're going to do this year. I'll just walk you through it quickly. This represents one state with 4 clubs. 4 clubs go down the left-hand side. You'll notice we're doing things in 2-month blocks across the bottom. First thing we do with all 4 clubs is we do a pre-test on these multiple measures. We ask them to look back 2 months and to tell us about what risks were in their environment, what solutions they came up with, what they implemented. The 2 clubs, marked club number 1 and 2, they engage in the situational prevention approach, while the 2 other clubs do business as usual. We're going to try to do some matching between those so that there'll be pairs to make it a little bit more of an even comparison. At the end of the 2 months, we do a post-test, and then we switch over. The 2 clubs that we're doing business as usual do the active situational prevention approach. The first 2 go back to business as usual with the exception that they're implementing solutions, hopefully, off their lists of risks. We do a post-test and we do one more follow-up, and as I said, our hope is maybe to do a follow-up 3 or 6 months out, if possible. I want to, well, let me just say before I leave this, well, it's going to go. Let me just say before I leave this that our hope is to generate enough information with this, or at least some, to begin a conversation with insurance folks about whether or not there's a possibility of interesting them in becoming more involved in this process where they might provide a small incentive for clubs to actually go through this process once a year. If we could do that, what we could do is move this from low cost or no cost to actually revenue positive. And we could have a built-in incentive for hopefully getting closer to those 4,000 clubs all being interested in doing this process. The other thing I just want to mention quickly is that there's another component to this. We were interested in seeing if we could use the implementation manual to turn it into a train-the-trainer type of consultation tool. We're going to check this out. We're going to do trainings with 2 different rape crisis centers to see if we can train rape crisis workers to actually use this model as part of their consultation. Part of this came from trying to be synergistic about getting this out there and getting more tests of it. Part of it was based on the fact that we got reports from them that they get calls from organizations all the time, and that these organizations need help, they need support, they need ideas, they're looking for resources, and a lot of these rape crisis centers offer these services, these consultation services, either free or at very low cost. So it seemed like it was worth looking to see if we could train folks in a way that we were comfortable with to be better consultants around these issues. Future direction-wise, as I said to you, I've had the opportunity to use this in a hospital setting with Boys and Girls Club now. We've had some conversations. I've actually done some focus groups with teachers and gotten some information that's been very interesting. Interested in looking at expanding to see how this model works or fits for other types of settings. We're also going to be looking at this potentially as an evaluation tool. If you think about the first half of this, where we generate risks across a particular youth-serving organization, it offers an interesting opportunity to give you a very holistic picture about potentially all or most of the risks in that environment. So it might be something that might be useful if they're doing some very focused types of prevention programs. The question is how well does what's being done in terms of focus prevention generalize into the larger environment and create a safer, larger environment? And also, at that point, what else is left that maybe you still want to intervene with? One other thing I want to mention to you is that I got kind of interested in this idea about differences between youth-serving organizations that make a difference. And I'm starting to wonder whether or not if you were able to group youth-serving organizations by these or other factors, would you get predictable risks that come up? And if you did, could you proactively think about intervening based on a profile of a youth-serving organization to make sure that those risks didn't develop into a particular kind of problem or an incident? I'm going to stop there. I'm going to thank Boys and Girls Club of America, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, and in particular my colleague Les Nichols, and I appreciate your time.